Sheriff of Babylon manages to imbue a comic book page with the sense of a dusty desert landscape incredibly well, and actually has a very cinematic sense to its visuals with its controlled, minimised palette range and textured art decisions by Mitch Gerads. This episode I want to take a look at some of the decisions made in the art style and the colours that helps give Sheriff of Babylon such a specific voice. You're watching Strip Panel Naked, I'm Hass, and I'm going to show you some of the cool stuff lurking in the pages of some of the best comics. So there's a couple of things that Gerads does across every single page in all 12 issues of this series, and before we go through them, I want to establish what the aim is for Babylon, because that will also help understand the reasoning behind a lot of the choices being made. Sheriff of Babylon aims for a sense of realism very immediately. The first page of the comic in issue 1 shows this dead man with the location text of Baghdad, Iraq, as a very specific location, a very specific date, and finally tied into a specific real-world event. So from page 1, the comic tells you what it is, a comic about war, post-war, humanity that suffers from it, set in the real world with real locations and an aim towards realistic people. Okay, so that gives us a good sort of starting point for understanding this. And then you turn the next page and the first issue sets up the scope and scale, while still having that blood red stain that pulls you down to the people we saw on the preceding page. So it's about humanity too, right? And the way the scale of the war plays off against the scale of the individuals. That's basically Sheriff of Babylon in a nutshell. And now there's 5 things that occur throughout the series that Gerads does to make the effect and those themes hit home, beyond the actual specific contents of the panels as scripted by Tom King. The first is texture. Every page has a texture overlay on the art, placed above everything else on the page, except for lettering for presumably sort of practical purposes. But there's clear examples on some of the pages with more open flat colours like this one. You can see how it almost looks like a small sort of dirty tyre track that has ran across the page, like every image has been scuffed up and dirtied and no longer pristine. It might be small, but it means that the images have what looks like specks of dirt across them, and means that a page like this, which has quite a narrow focus of 2 men from the same angle, sort of becomes obfuscated with an effect of a dirty lens on a camera. And as to how that relates back to theme, it gives everything a sense of grounded grittiness, that this place is constantly kicking up dust that gets in the eyes, right, in your face, that this place has an edge of uncomfortability to it. And the comic doesn't want you to forget that. It's constantly putting up a kind of barrier between you and the content of the story, and reminding you as a reader that this environment and the story contained within it is not pristine. It's murky, and obviously both literally and metaphorically. And the second thing it does is down to tool choices by Gerads. He loves a dry brush tool, both in his black inks and in his colours. On this page, for example, in the conversation between these 2 characters, you can see that in both the colours and in the inks. Panel 7 has this shot where the chair has a dry brush black ink against it, creating this kind of, scratchy, dirty surface. And on the panel after, you can see the dry brushing in the jeans and against the underside of the table. It's even in the face of the character in panel 9. So by choosing the dry brush and not something more like a wetter, inkier pen tool, it backs up what Gerads is doing with the overlays, in creating something that feels just less clean, sort of more unkempt, more dangerous. And Gerads is doing the same thing in the colours too, which are kind of painted with this dry brush tool. We can see how the shadow tone on the hands isn't cleanly brushed or cleanly defined, like you might find in a sort of a cel-shaded comic if you think like Darwin Cook, and it's not a gradient like you might find traditionally in a superhero comic. It's hard, it's roughened, and it's gritty. And so the world also feels that same way to us as readers, because everything that we're getting back from the artwork is telling us that. Every sense of the lines in the artwork, it pushes that effect, even down to the very tool being used. There's no reprise here. And on the subject of colours, the third thing that Gerads does is really limit the palette. There's very little in Sheriff of Babylon that isn't one washed tone as a whole scene. Most scenes are that one colour, and usually that one colour is blue, red, green, or a kind of sandy orange. In this example, you can see the scene is all shades of red. And in this example, it's all orange wash on everything. That kind of dusty desert warmth, where the warmth isn't a nice afternoon glow, but it's quite this oppressive and unrelenting brown-orange mix. Even scenes which are pretty beautifully rendered, like this one, are still cast in that exact same wash. There's just no getting away from it. And by having issues so forcefully restricted, it becomes almost claustrophobic in its storytelling for you as a reader. The world is bearing down on these characters, and there is just no sense of relief, exactly as I was talking about before with the dry brush tool. And it's just this constant restriction of storytelling and content that makes it really difficult to see this as kind of a happy story. And mentioning the inks, the fourth thing that Gerads does is restrict any deep blacks. Often black lines in comics is what we'd call the inks, even though, this is digital artwork, so it's not quite that, is a much deeper black. Large areas of black are usually rendered in what we'd call rich black, but Gerads doesn't do that. If you take a look at this page, for example, you can see the difference in the more traditional rich black and what Gerads uses as the colour for his own lines. So the left side panels are this deep black with the text, but the areas that would be black on the right are actually more of like a darker brown. A little earlier, you can see the same thing on the character's clothes too. This effect works to double down yet again everything we've already talked about, because it fades out the world a little, and it gives it a murkiness that creates a filter between reader and subject. And it also looks a little like faded film, or film that has been overexposed, where the sun has bleached out the contrast of the image. And if you bleach out the contrast of the image, that restricts the tone even more, because suddenly the image becomes a lot flatter. And when you take away that range and that depth from the image, you get that claustrophobic sensation even more. He takes that claustrophobic feeling from the limited colour palette, and then he makes that even more intense by limiting the range in every image. And finally, using that idea of film, it's the cinematic compositions that Gerads uses. I think part of this arguably is Gerads' use of photo reference in creating realistic scenes and characters, but he has a very cinematic eye for composition too, in that it has a visual consistency in choices and framing angles. The sequence of two characters having a conversation in the broken pool house from issue 5 is a really cool example of that. His decisions seem to revolve around mixing up these eye-level angles of characters and mid-shots and wides, and occasionally sprinkling in, like a kind of a cutaway from the scene. In this case, the page starts with a shot of the roof, allowing this beat of time to pass, but what it does, as you'll notice, is keep the framing grounded from the base at an eye-level positioning in the room, as though we're there with them. The rest of the scene then plays out in mids and wides, the same shots repeated, which gives it a sense of being almost storyboarded, reusing the same master wides and mids as you might do in film and TV. To me, it seems to work on relying on a visual language that we do understand from those two mediums, but transposing it somewhat to the comic book page. And the next page of this scene shows you that same thing, right? It mixes up framing choices, but really it's the same handful of compositions. And by doing this, he's attaching a clever relationship in the visuals of the comic to visuals of things that you've seen before that contain real people, not drawn. So it keeps the whole thing within the real world of how you'd feasibly shoot this with two actors in a location. And all of those things are working very specifically to forward the feel of the comic. The kind of ideas it's presenting and putting forward rely very heavily on decisions Gerads makes in his presentation. The texture gives it a murky, clouded view, backed up by the dry brushing in the inks and colours, which are constrained with very tight palettes and limited range, with inks that never really reach a deep black, bleached out from the world, while Gerads chooses compositions that place the reader at eye level with the characters, very much directly in their world, at their same point of view, repeating visual language lifted heavily from gritty TV and film choices, and built into the comic book form. And with all of this, we're talking artistic decisions without really mentioning anything done in the script level. This is purely aesthetic choices made by Gerads. It shows how much heavy lifting the art does in comics before you even look at the interplay of images next to each other, or dialogue, or the action in each panel even. All of these decisions, down to the very tool being used to draw the comic book, contributes to the feeling the reader takes from the work. And Sheriff of Babylon is a really strong example of an artist in full control of all the tools at their disposal. Thanks for watching. Strip Panel Naked has a Patreon that's full of exclusive content with over 300 articles, annotations and reading lists from the past 2.5 years of the series. If you'd like to support the channel, you can there, and I'd love your support. You can get my Eisner nominated magazine at panelxpanel.com and find me on Twitter at HassanOE. Finally, hit subscribe and the notification bell to keep up to date with all the latest episodes, and I'll see you next time.